Urbe ad Astra bonus episode 3, part 1.
Hello, welcome to Urbe ad Astra, where we talk about the craft of writing, history, science fiction, fantasy, science, and other nifty topics.
Hello, I'm Joe Walton, Hugo and Nebula Award-winning science fiction and fantasy writer and vocateur reader.
And I'm Ada Palmer, also an SF novelist and a historian of European thought, censorship, books, the Renaissance, and today, different nouns we use to refer to the undead.
Today, we are going to talk about the very fascinating subject of chapters.
Yes, chapters. Subdividing your book into chapters. What it's for, what it achieves, all the different things that a chapter can do. And this will be just us discussing this based on our craft of writing experience as well as our reading experience.
So, people talk about chapter books, meaning short books for children that are divided into chapters and are one step up from picture books. But other than that, chapters are not much discussed.
Right, they're sort of a ubiquitously assumed subdivision tool that a book will have chapters, almost always. People will sometimes discuss that there aren't chapters in the rare books that don't have chapters.
Yes. But people very seldom want to talk about what chapters are for and why we have chapters.
No.
And I think at the simplest, it is just that books are long and you want pause points within the book.
Well, or speaking as a book historian, looking at it at the other end, there is a physical limit to the length a scroll can be before it gets really obnoxious to roll and unroll. And so in very old pre-codex books, there was a standard of dividing it, your text into books, where a book really meant a reasonable length to fit on one scroll, so that you would finish reading that scroll and then roll it up and move on to the next scroll. And so it was actually a physical limit imposed by papyrus in the Mediterranean or the fragility of rice paper later on in the East. That made subdividing your thoughts into sections of a particular length be a requirement, much like how earlier video games are structured by how much can fit on the cartridge that the machine is loading, or earlier text on computers is going to be limited by file size. And yet we then inherited this into later book technologies that don't require that. They don't have scrolls, but that inherited the expectation of subdividing into chunks of about that length.
Yes, I was just going to say that sometime after we stopped using papyrus scrolls, but before the modern world, when I first started writing on a computer in ProText, the maximum file length that I could save was 18K, which is about 3,000 words.
Right.
A chapter.
Which would be the limit on your chapters, in a sense, yes.
So that became, for me, the natural chapter length.
Because you had practiced writing in it, just as Aristotle or Epicurus were used to writing on a papyrus scroll and had a natural length to the books within their texts.
Yeah.
But as we work at other lengths, whether it's writing on a codex or writing on a modern Word document that doesn't have limits like that, the length of chapter comes to be up to us. And you can have extremely short chapters, and you can have extremely long chapters, and you can have very frequent chapters, and you can have no chapters.
And you write chapters that are very, very different lengths from each other.
Yes, I do.
Whereas my chapters still tend to be around 3,000 words. It's not that I don't have some chapters that are longer than that, but if a chapter is getting to be 6,000 words, I'll usually split it.
Right. Well, and I think it can, chapter length depends very much on what you're using chapters for in that particular work. And let's start with discussing elements of fiction, then we can talk a bit about how nonfiction wields it differently. But chapters can serve a number of different functions, and in any given novel that you're sitting down to write, you can make a bunch of decisions about what chapters are going to be doing. So, for example, if you have multiple narrators, then one of the functions of chapters is that you can smoothly switch from narrator A to narrator B in a way that your reader understands. Another tool of chapters can be that it's a different scene, that the action is in one place and contiguous for one chapter, and then the end of chapter will signal a change in time or a change in place. But you can also have chapters that begin exactly on the next sentence of the previous chapter, where the break isn't about time and space. It might still be about point of view, that you've switched from the first character in the scene's point of view to the second character in the scene's point of view. Or it could be about theme, that the earlier chapter focused on one particular sort of thematic subtopic, often brought up in the title, and that the second chapter has a different one. I have a pair of chapters like this early in the first Terra Ignota book, which is at a party, and we are meeting several different people who show up for the first time at the party. And so the party is divided into several chapters, each of them titled with a title that is themed around what important new person/faction we are meeting for the first time in that chapter, which serves the function of, you get to the end of the chapter, you start a new chapter, the reader sees that change in chapter title and realizes, we are moving on from thinking and focusing on character A, and we are about to encounter character B or faction B or some new thematic thing. But you can also have a book where every chapter is a break in time and space and is at a different point. I've also seen some books, especially I think thriller or suspense-focused books, where the chapter end will be on a cliffhanger, even if it's in the middle of a conversation. And it's almost as if the function of a chapter is to go da-da, da-da-da, like to focus you on, that was a really dramatic thing that was just discovered or said, so that the end of the chapter isn't about a transition in point of view or a transition in space or time or even a transition in focus, but it's about the change of, now there has been a new revelation, or now there is about to be a new dramatic something, and it's a change in the stakes, we could say.
Yes.
The change in the stakes rather than in the setting or the point of view.
I think the thing that all of those things have in common is that it's asking the reader to take a breath.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's the thriller thing, then it's a gasp. Yes. The breath that you're asking them to take.
Yes.
But when it is a transition, you are taking a breath between one chapter and the next. The ultimate in weird cliffhanger doing it like that things is Roger Zelazny's Doorways in the Sand, where every chapter starts with a cliffhanger that has absolutely nothing to do with the end of the previous chapter.
Sounds like reading Orlando Furioso.
And then it goes back to how the character, the first person narrator, got into the predicament that is the end of that is the beginning of the chapter and is the cliffhanger.
Right.
So
that's a structure that's not uncommon in television. That the before the credits thing will be a crisis, and that then the subsequent episode will lead you up to that crisis, so you get to the crisis toward the midpoint of the end point of the television episode. A structure that is incentivized by the having a hook before the credits structure of television, or indeed of films like Bond movies.
I wonder if that's where he got it from, because Doorways in the Sand is a 1970s book, so it could have been influenced by that before the credits thing and thinking, can I do this in fiction?
Mm.
But I've always seen it as kind of gimmicky
Mm.
in that book. And it's certainly clever, but it is clever in that Princess Bride, yeah, you're very clever, now shut up way, where it kind of gets in its own light.
Mm.
And it interferes with your enjoyment of the book that it is written in that kind of way.
Right. Well, because it can achieve the inexorable unrolling of plot thing, where when you know what has to happen, you know somebody has to die, you know Patroclus has to die. It gives a weight and an importance to the inexorable of unrolling of, but exactly how is Patroclus going to die? And here is Zeus on high waffling about whether to kill Patroclus this way or that way, which can work very well
Yes.
narratively, but I think doing it over and over in every chapter could be tricky, and it would be hard for each one of them to justify itself. Because I think one of the things that the inexorable unrolling structure, which I just love, requires is for it to be a really weighty and interesting thing that is inexorably unrolling, and it can't be arbitrary throes of life endangerment, a phrase I will never forget from when my father and I were scrolling through TiVo, and it has those little pop-up summaries of what is happening in any given episode as you're scrolling past at random, and the episode summary for an episode of Merlin was, now that Merlin has been rescued from the throes of life endangerment. And we were just riveted by what was going on that was so difficult to summarize that they resorted to the throes of life endangerment rather than telling us what the threat was.
It sounds like a computer translation. Yeah, wow, the throes of life endangerment. Yeah, and one of the reasons it doesn't work in Doorways in the Sand is that it's a comedy. That it is funny. And they are funny cliffhanger things, and there is no suspense, though you do want to know how he got into the predicament each time.
Right.
But it's not enough. And I also love the Patroclus thing when people make it work. But there's nothing worse than it not working.
A high risk, you got to really invest in this and make it work.
Yeah.
Structure. Yeah.
Yeah. And it can be really, really great, but it can also be boring when it doesn't work.
Well,
and that is
requires the writer to constantly be remembering to think very hard about what is and isn't at stake. And I was, just watching an episode of a television program in which, the adversary had captured the protagonist and was threatening to cut off his hands. And we have already seen the protagonist in the future, and he had his hands.
Right.
So there was no suspense about that threat. And the suspense was about how will he get out of it, not will it happen. But the writing edged a little too much toward wanting us to actually be in suspense as to whether it would happen, as opposed to just focusing on how he would get out of it. And it was a very, very subtle thing. I think 2 or 3 changed sentences of dialogue and 2 or 3 changes of how long a camera angle lingered on one thing versus another thing. Even moments where we were seeing the face of the bad guy looking ominous too much and the contemplative face of the hero planning his escape not enough. If we had just seen a different face for a few more seconds and the other for a few fewer seconds, it could have worked. A very, very subtle bit of the writers forgetting a little bit that the suspense can't lie on A, it has to lie on B, and that they can't milk suspense out of A. Even if it feels as if they should be able to, because in a differently structured narrative in which we haven't seen the protagonist in the future, they would be able to get suspense out of both A and B.
So One of the things as a reader that I use chapter breaks for is how long it's going to take me, and then I will make dinner or go to the bathroom or get another cup of tea or something. And I used to do this with physical books where I would just look how many pages were in the chapter and know how long that would take me to read. And I do it on the Kindle where it tells me that a chapter is going to be 1 minute or 17 minutes or whatever it thinks it is. And I absolutely use those as a reader a lot.
Yep.
But I don't usually think about how much time it's going to take the reader to read my chapters.
Yeah, I know when I write that I come away from each chapter with the impression that the length of the chapter was proportional to how long I spent writing the chapter. Which is how in book 4, for example, there are 2 quite long chapters. Actually, there are 3 quite long chapters, but I sincerely believed that the one that is the shortest of the 3 was far longer than the other 2, because I spent so much longer actually writing it, and I inhabited that emotional space for such a gruelingly long period of time, as opposed to the others. And I have to say, when you're writing a chapter that has intense emotion and you're occupying that emotional space for weeks on end, that can be very exhausting, and can leave you with a sense of a chapter being longer than it is, at least for me.
Yeah, I didn't. When I read all of my books aloud during the pandemic to a group of friends on Discord, I realized that my 3,000 word chapters take about 20 minutes for me to read aloud. Which meant that I could read 2 of them, and then Gretchen could read one chapter of something else, usually, for the other 20 minutes of the hour that we were reading aloud. And then I did, there's a couple of books of mine that have very different length chapters. And one of the things that I was thinking when I was reading Lifeload aloud is I'm never writing chapters like this again. They're terrible to read out loud. They're way too long. And then, among others, doesn't have chapters.
Right.
Because it's written in diary form, and the diary entries take up very different amounts of space. So sometimes it'll just be 2 or 3 lines from a day, and other times it'll be pages and pages and pages. And I actually found it very hard to write because I'm used to writing, thinking in terms of the rhythm of chapters. So both when I read it aloud, I had to keep looking when I was reading it aloud and thinking, how much am I going to read today? Where does it make sense to stop?
Right.
Which I just didn't have to when it was any of my other things that had chapters. But when I was writing it, I found the rhythm and the pace of the novel were weird, and I had to keep thinking about word count. Because it didn't have chapters.
Well, and your books tend to be pretty similar in length, as I recall, to each other.
Yes.
And so the rhythm and word count are much more related in terms of where the climax might be and so on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and the sort of question of how much room have I got left in this? I mean, nothing would stop me writing a longer book or a shorter book, really, if I needed to. But it's a case of what feels right and where I am with it.
So I certainly plan out individual chapters to have their own internal pacing and a sense of, is this a chapter that's going to start calm and contemplative and then escalate? Is this a chapter that's going to start peppy and energetic and then move into different kinds of intensities? I'll have a kind of a arc within my mind, which I would compare to the structure of a song, which might have intensities at different points planned out per chapter. And I also definitely plan out for the transition from chapter to chapter. Is this going to be a transition from chapter to chapter where the reader feels like, yeah, this is a good stopping point. This is a good point to sit back and think about it and take a break and read on in a bit. or the ones where I know I've just set up something that's high intensity so that the person is going to want to urgently turn the page to find out the next thing. And I know that I tend to avoid making those intense, gotta find out what happens immediately next transitions when the chapter involved is really long.
Right.
In order to make there be more of a natural break point within the book. People talk about books that are page turners and, I couldn't put it down. And I think a lot of the thriller type structure with the cliffhanger at the end of every node, every chapter ending is designed for that. It's designed to try to make you not set the book down. And I think that somewhat has to do with how much of what the book is aiming at is the plot and how much what the book is aiming at is more contemplative things like themes or issues or world questions. Terra Ignota has a plot and it has characters, but it also really wants you to sit down and think about, oh, neat, I've just learned about this different way citizenship could work. I want to chew on this idea for a while. Oh, neat, what an interesting way to think about work in the future and how work hours could be. I want to pause and discuss that with friends over dinner. A lot of the goals of the book are not the plot or just the characters, but in fact things where it intends you to pause and have a conversation or pause and have a contemplation with yourself chewing over an idea. And so it wouldn't have made sense to also make it the kind of book that you can't put down and have to race on through, because that doesn't give you the time to pause and consider the ideas before I move on to do the next thing that I want you to consider.
What I usually think is that each chapter has a beginning, a middle, and an end at its simplest. And I usually know what the end of the chapter is going to be. So I'm working towards that. Whatever kind of ending it's going to be, if it's going to be resolving an episode, or if it's going to be a revelation or a cliffhanger or whatever, but I'll be working towards that myself when I'm writing. And then I will stop when I get to it. Do you generally stop at the end of a chapter, or do you go on into the next chapter yourself immediately?
In a session of writing?
Yeah.
I try in sessions of writing to make myself not, if I'm wanting to stop writing soon and I'm approaching the last paragraph, I make myself not do the last paragraph then. I make myself wait and do the last paragraph when I can do it fresh and first on a new day of writing, on which I have a little bit of time to, reread the last couple pages, think about it, be already thinking about the new chapter that I'm about to start, and then craft that last paragraph when I'm at my freshest and when I'm thinking about both chapters co-equally together as opposed to being enmeshed in the previous one. And I've found that by doing that, I get better endings and I don't rush them and then come back to them and find that they're not as good as I want them to be. So a very different way of pacing the way we write them.
Though I will usually then, when I go back to write more, which might be a different day or might be later that same day, but I'll have had a little break at the end of the chapter.
Mm-hmm.
When I go back to it, I will reread the whole of the last chapter before going on and usually revise it as I go. I sort of rolling revise.
Yeah,
that.
I rolling revise too.
Yeah.
But I don't usually rolling revise when I'm finishing the chapter, because when I will have rolling revised as I did the chapter. Generally because the fact that I'm also a historian and doing a lot of other things will mean there will be multi-day gaps between writing, which will then require me to reread the chapter to know where I was.
Yeah.
So I do my rolling revisions when I return to writing after several days without, when that has to happen. But then when I've finished each fresh chapter, I send that chapter to the beta reader, who's usually just one or two people, who is reading it chapter by chapter. And then that beta reader will read it and make comments. And then I'll sit down with that person on the phone and we'll go through together as they make their comments one by one. And I reread the chapter live with them. And my rolling revision happens while I'm on the phone, having that person talk through what their feelings were at different points. Because what they're not giving me is, oh, this sentence has a typo and I recommend doing this other thing. It's at this point I was thinking this, and at this point I was wondering this, and at this point I laughed, and at this point I really liked this character and felt that I had a good grip of them, so that I get to check off in my head, all right, this worked in the chapter, this didn't. And my rolling revision will happen at that stage. So I don't do an extra one right when I've finished the chapter.
Mm-hmm.
It'll happen when I've sent it to the first reader. And then
that's
I'll send
interesting.
it to the second one. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Yeah. And you plan out your whole novel, so you plan out your chapters, so you know what's going to be in each chapter?
And I know it's going to be in the next chapter as well. So I know very much things like, this chapter is looking at the theme of space exploration. The next 2 chapters won't. So this would be a good point to have a lot of intensity about space exploration. Or conversely, here's a moment in this chapter where space exploration has come up, but space exploration is going to be the centerpiece of a chapter that's 2 chapters from now. So I'll make this discussion of it briefer and lighter and save my emotionally moving discussions of space exploration for a chapter or 2, because they're going to move into center stage then in a way that they aren't now. So that becomes part of the planning. But it also means that I'll know in advance a sense of tone. I'll know in advance, this chapter is intended to be a cathartic chapter that leaves you feeling emotionally refreshed, because the next chapter is going to be a very heavy chapter where a lot of the inexorable tragedy structures unroll, or the previous chapter was a heavy chapter in which a lot of inexorable tragedies unrolled, or this chapter needs to begin with a refreshing lightness because you've come out of something heavy, but then it's going to move into something very emotionally intense in the final third of the chapter, so that I'll know what the emotional arc has to be connecting chapter to chapter, which is essential to planning the ending and beginning combo. The ending of each previous chapter and the beginning of the next being planned very carefully as partners.
Yes. And I've sometimes, because I've actually done this very differently in different books.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I've known exactly, not necessarily exactly everything that needs to be in the chapter, but the shape of the emotional arc that needs to be going through multiple chapters and where I am with that, which is sort of what you're talking about as some of that as well, I think. And I've been very, very aware of that. And sometimes I've been very aware of the events that need to go in each chapter and the shape of the book. And I've had novels where I've had that, even though I'm not really planning, but I still have had that. And then there's others where I've kind of got myself into a muddle and got ahead of myself, and then I've had to rewrite and revise and move things around a lot. I had to do that with Or What You Will, and that was really difficult and annoying and bad, and it would have been so much better if I'd just got it right in the first place. And it took me ages to fix that and to sort of move that stuff around, because I'd written some of it out of order.
Right. Which is always tricky, because the pace of readers becoming used to not just world building details, but facts about characters, how you're feeling about a character at a particular point, how much you have seen the warm side or not seen the warm side of a character, and signatures of language. If there are particular words that you're setting up to have special weight in that book, if you're using a particular word in a particular way Sea of Stars, Utopia, Intolerable, right? There's a point in chapter 4 where there's a reflection on the meaning of the word intolerable, not chapter 4, book 4. And anything that has the word intolerable in it means something different to the reader. If it's before that reflection on the word intolerable or after that reflection on the word intolerable. And if you needed to move something from before to after or after to before, you'd have to go through and think, actually, this is the wrong word now because it has the wrong weight now. Because I used it when it was a light word and now it's a heavy word, or I used it when it was a heavy word and now it's a light word.
Yeah, and the unrolling imagery as well.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, when we talk about writing, you'll describe your process, and I will just think, no, that is completely different. That is absolutely not what I do. And then other things like that, that is absolutely what I do, and what I am thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And the words and the imagery patterns and the way that all of that is building up.
Right, and from this moment on, this noun, this character, this adjective will be extra charged for the reader of this book because it was associated with this moment, and forever after, when you use it, it invokes that moment. And that too is part of the craftsmanship planning process, knowing that forever after X chapter, this will mean something different. And sometimes it's because you've used the word in a chapter title, which gives it special weight and focus. Or sometimes it'll be for other reasons.
And you used the title, Perhaps the Stars, as a chapter title in To Like the Lightning.
Yes. Ellipsis, Perhaps the Stars. One of the things I do there is have a sentence. The last sentence of the previous chapter ends with ... and then the chapter title begins with ... finishing the unfinished sentence at the end of the previous book. And I've had a lot of people comment on how powerful they found that. That bridging of the thought, having a pause in the middle of a sentence. And it's an example of one of these, we are shifting away, because the previous sentence is about the earth and empire and power and earthly power. And so the sentence is neither earth nor atom, but ... perhaps the stars, and that is the chapter that starts to be about the focus on humanity reaching out into the stars. And so it's very, very much a chapter transition, which is about a transition of focus and what we are thinking about, as opposed to where we are or who is speaking or anything like that.
Right, and the reader isn't going to forget that. And the reader now will know that that's the title of book 4.
Yeah. Well, and I remember the first time I was talking to a friend who had read the first 3 books and told him, who asked, do you have a title for book 4? And I said, it's Perhaps the Stars, and he teared up.
Right.
Because you remember that phrase, you remember what that is thematically. You have the sense of, oh no, the fragility of that dream. Wow. And it has that punch. And chapter title, using something as a chapter title, whether it's a character name or other things, can give it that weight.
And you have some very beautiful and poetic chapter titles. And obviously you think about them a lot.
Yes, I think very hard about the chapter titles. And I sometimes think a lot about, when I'm looking at something else, whether it seems to have thought hard about the title or not. For example, I read Sherlock Holmes short stories a lot. And, some of them have great titles, like The Speckled Band or The Dancing Men, that are very intriguing. But a lot of them are just the name of the stupid fancy house where it takes place, like the Abbey Grange.
You can't remember which one
you can't remember which one it is. It doesn't mean anything. And, you get so much power when you've thought hard about the chapter title. And people say, oh, but it flits by. I never remember the titles of chapters. And it's like, well, yes and no. You remember that phrase when it comes up again. You might not consciously remember that it was a chapter title, or perhaps you do, but it gives it extra weight. But also, even if you don't remember it afterward, you see it in the moment that you're turning the page, and it conjoins with that all-important opening sentence of the chapter to set the new tone. But another thing I do with chapter titles that you can do is having a pattern to their structure and then varying that pattern. So, for example, I'll have Mycroft's poetic chapter titles, which are usually phrases of, varying in length a bit. And then I'll have these much longer chapter titles, like The Interlude in which Martin Guildbreaker pursues the question of Dr. Cater Weeksbooth.
Yeah.
And just the fact that the chapter title is suddenly 3 times as long and normal and different in style makes you say, okay, this is a totally different kind of chapter. And you're ready for it to be a totally different kind of chapter before you begin reading it. You know from word 1 that you should interpret word 1 differently from the way you would interpret word 1 of a Mycroft chapter. And sometimes by varying the pattern, much as varying paragraph length, if you have a lot of short paragraphs and then occasionally use long paragraphs, or if you tend to have long paragraphs and then have a short paragraph, it gives it extra punch. So similarly, having a chapter title that is very different from the others, whether it's much longer or whether it's one word or whether it's in all caps, or whether, you have to have a good reason for the difference, but whatever it is that's different will make your reader go, oh, this is different. But you have to live up to it, right? The chapter has to live up to the fact that it got to have a special title.
I did that in Tooth and Claw, where I had a chapter that was called A Proposal. And then I had a chapter that was called A Second Proposal, and so on. And then I had a chapter that was called, I think it was A Betrayal, and then the second betrayal. And then I got to the point where I was having a chapter where there was going to be a proposal, and I thought, how many have I had now? I need to go look. And then I thought, no, wait. And I called it the narrator admits to having lost track of how many proposals and betrayals there have been in this novel so far, which is a brilliant chapter title, and it was sort of really just so exactly right for that chapter. It was perfect, and it was breaking the pattern while also conforming to the pattern.
Right, and referencing the pattern and being whimsical about the pattern with a type of whimsy that absolutely perfectly matches the whimsy that saturates elements of that book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I just, I laughed out loud as I was typing it, but it was just exactly what it needed, and even people who didn't, when they read the chapter that was a 7th proposal, sort of maybe didn't even look at that, but they were aware of it. When they saw this great big long chapter title that was in which the narrator admits to having lost track of they would be aware that there had been all of these chapters that were called that before, which is and it's a Trollope pastiche, and Trollope always has titles called A Proposal or whatever,
Right.
So I was doing that, and it was just a very fun thing to do. I also have chapters in that book called things like Hypocrisy, where it'll be a one word thing, and they're very, very, very solid. And because I was taking the shape of the story from Trollope's Framley Parsonage,
right,
I very much was aware with the chapters in that book of what was going to go in the chapters, but as I thought about it, and it was going to be changed, and my characters became different from the Trollope original characters because they were dragons, and all of this kind of got away from me, and I realized I needed more stuff that wasn't in the original, that I particularly needed a thread to do with the other sister, Hanair, who barely is mentioned. I think she's got like 2 lines in Framley Parsonage, but that she needed her own thread, which became a very interesting thread to do with suffrage. And that sort of developed. And I sort of suddenly sort of saw the shape of how all of the threads went together, and I have big chapters that have little chapters in them.
Mm. I do that in nonfiction, but not in fiction, I've found so far.
Yeah, it's the only time I've ever done it. And I'd already written like a quarter of the book before I realized that was the way to do it.
Or I
And they
guess
all have titles.
no, I guess I do that in the title chapter of Seven Surrenders, which is subdivided
Oh,
into
yes.
7 sections, each of them with a surrender separated not by numbers or mini chapter headings, but by a line of asterisks.
But it really helped me structure the book when I realized that it had to have these big chapters with the little chapters in it, because I had so many threads, because it was a Victorian novel.
Neat.
And it really was so great when I realized that, and sort of rewrote my plan with that shape,
Well, and
and that I could see how it worked.
it's a thing that works very well for handling when you have multiple plot threads and they're all moving in parallel, and
Yeah.
you're trying to get the reader to think about the fact that all of these 5 things are moving at once. So you could imagine a chapter in which, a bunch of different characters are trying to be the first one to get to the Holy Grail. And you have a chapter which has subsections in which each of the 5 characters, passes through the last several steps to reach the room where it is, and you realize one by one that they're all reaching the room at the same time, even though they're doing it by a variety of different where they came from and how long it took them and exactly what happened at the end, and that you're seeing the same sort of span of time 5 times, implying even within iteration 2 of the 5 that once you've gotten through all 5, then the next chapter will be all 5 characters are now in the room with the Holy Grail. That it allows you to bring a bunch of threads together and let the reader realize in advance what the parallels are and what the structuring is going to be. Which then lets you get the reader to see things that would otherwise be subtle. So again, using that imaginary Holy Grail example, if you've got your first character is getting toward where the Holy Grail is by fighting their way through a dungeon, and the second character is getting to where the Holy Grail is by casting a teleportation spell, and the third character is getting to where the Holy Grail is by moving backward in time, jumping from Arthuriana book in a library to Arthuriana book in a library by navigating through threads of story. You can then have the fourth character be, somewhere else having a conversation with Charlemagne and not seeming to go anywhere. And you're reading the conversation, you're like, somehow this conversation with Charlemagne has to end up with the person arriving at where the Holy Grail is. And the reader knows that as you're watching the conversation happen, and you're in suspense. Is it going to turn out the Holy Grail is actually just already in the room? Is Charlemagne going to say a thing which will be the key to the riddle that we then realize the person solves like off camera in between that gets them to the Holy Grail? Is the Holy Grail going to somehow be conjured? Is it going to turn out that this person is the Holy Grail? But you read that mini chapter knowing arrival at Holy Grail must be the conclusion of this encounter, which is seemingly without movement, and all of the others have had movement, and it makes your reader think, oh, interesting. In what way is a conversation movement? Is what, thinking about the parallel between fighting through a dungeon and learning information in a conversation as a form of movement. And there's just all these different fascinating tools you can give the reader for meta-analyzing what is happening in that mini chapter, because they know it has to be parallel to the previous chapters.
That is a tapestry technique. It's a technique that you see in books that are written using the sort of tapestry method with a lot of threads, which people often don't think is a good way of writing books, but it can be. It can give you wonderful things like that reader experience of reading that conversation with Charlemagne, which you couldn't get any other way.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I think with a tapestry book or a many characters, all of whose POVs we're trying to alternately really get invested in, they can fail when the reason that we're following this character is that this character is awesome and the author loves them and the reader probably also loves them, but there isn't anything particularly unique that that character experience contributes. If that character doesn't contribute something unique, like a unique theme or a unique ethical point of view or a unique ability to bring a new issue into the book. You know, this character is the one that brings the issue of hereditary monarchy or hereditary inequality into the book. And this character is the person who brings the theme of it being difficult to communicate across barriers of language into the book. If there are characters where there isn't a big difference in what they bring into the story and they're just sort of there because they're a great character, I think that's when the tapestry structure can fail because each individual thread isn't a unique color.
Yes.
And it's better to have those characters sort of grouped together so that you're experiencing a bunch of cool characters at once, but it's also fine that those characters are mainly contributing to one set of ideas. That a tapestry book really does require each character to be bringing something unique beyond just who the character is.
Or where they are. The worst fails on this that I've seen are where it's quite clear to me that the author has thought, if I give a point of view to this person who has appeared in other points of view as a minor character and is a cool character, if I give them a point of view, then we can know what is going on in this particular region that all of my point of view characters have left, and important things are happening there, so I should give this character a point of view.
It's so tempting. It's so tempting, but don't do it.
Yes.
I remember being very tempted to do that at one point when I was doing the outlining for book 3. And I realized that just because of who was where and who trusted whom, I really had no way to access what the Mitsubishi faction was up to. And that it was really hard to get us, we needed to know what the Mitsubishi faction was doing, just like all the other ones. But there was nobody who would tell the people who could narrate it anything about what was going on. And it was so tempting to should I have a chapter narrated by character over there, but you really need to have a lot of reasons and not just that for switching POV. And in the end I realized, wait, I can have the character overhear one side of a phone conversation between a different character and somebody in that faction, and that'll give us a sense of distance and a sense of not having as much information as we would like, which is authentic to this experience, but will also give us just enough of what is going on to feel like we know how that faction is moving too. But boy, was it tempting, but the right call to not suddenly bring in another point of view, which would then not have follow-up.
No, you're absolutely right, because that is the thing that really doesn't work, and it also means that later on, what's going to happen to that character, to that thread, when other people are back there and they don't have the specific events to narrate? They've still got to continue to be a point of view character, or else they aren't going to, and that's its own question. And
right, because it's not that you have to commit to having this point of view character over and over. I have one chapter that's early in book 2
Yeah.
written by a character who doesn't write any other chapters, and it's so-and-so's chapter. And it's very clear at that point, it's so-and-so's chapter, that's going to be so-and-so's only chapter. And it's fine because it forever changes the reader's relationship with that character and how the reader feels about that character.
Yeah.
And it also tells you things that totally upend a lot of things you knew about what's going on in the whole book. And it has a lot of weight to it and a lot of consequence. And that character remains a character who's really important and in whom we are really deeply invested, and who is one of the bright sparks of the whole emotional arc of the book in a way that few other characters are. And so that follows through on that character having POV for one chapter, even though it's only the one chapter.
Yes. Yeah, and I think you made absolutely the right decision there because, yeah, I mean, you had to do it like that. There was no other way of doing it, considering what actually happens.
Right. Well, and also separate from that, I didn't say, oh, I don't have another way to convey this information, I'd better use this POV. It was the other way around of, I want to bring this character into the spotlight of the reader's attention. This character is going to be a major through thread emotionally and ideologically for the book. What would be a good way to bring this character distinctly and crisply into the forefront so that they stand out suddenly amid many other characters? Because this character really has to be distinct. Aha, I can give them a single point of view chapter in which we get their candid and intimate address to the reader, and that will really make this character unforgettably distinct. I did it so that the character would have a lot of weight on it, not in order to get the information across and then, oops, the character has a lot of weight on them now. Can I cope with that?
And that works really, really well. I have a couple of times been writing something that has very rigid rotation of point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Where, because I've got a very rigid rotation of point of view, and because I like writing 3,000 word chapters and not 6,000 word chapters, I ended up needing to have a chapter. This has happened to me twice in two different books, where I ended up needing a chapter from the point of view of a character where I didn't actually have anything that I knew was going to be in that chapter. And it couldn't be a lot of things because the other characters were needing to carry on having what's basically the second half of their chapters that had got too long. And I needed to do a thing. And both times, having to write that chapter and having to think of what was going to be in that chapter that I hadn't planned for in any way gave me a really powerful chapter.
Well, and I would say that I've experienced the same even in Terra Ignota, which is primarily which doesn't have rigid structuring like that, because of my outlining step where after I've put down the major beats of it and, made a list of chapters or events in order, or things that the reader will experience in order, because sometimes it might be a moment in which we have a flashback, so it's not an event in order, but it's the experience. I will then highlight the names of each character in a distinct color and zoom out until the outline becomes just a blur, and notice, oh, there's no yellow between here and here. And then I'll zoom back in and say, okay, I need a yellow character chapter in here, and stick that in, and then sit and think about it. What could we experience from the point of view of yellow character, or with yellow character in it, that involves yellow character in between this and this? Oh, we could have this happen and yellow character would be there. Oh, that would be a really neat way to do blah, blah. So I've had that same experience of the structuring requiring you to sit down and think through, I don't have a plan for a chapter here, but I need a chapter with X person. Oh, wow, I can do great things with X person in this spot.
I also, in Prize in the Game, which is the first time that this happened to me, and I had to write this chapter from the point of view of Ferdia, and I did it, and it was great, and it gave me so much It just gave me so much, and it was such a terrific chapter. And I then had to write another chapter from his point of view. Well, I didn't have to. He was dead. And I did write a chapter from his point of view after he was dead.
Neat.
Um, it starts off an under the world. Ferdia does not yet know that he is dead.
Mm. Well, and it's a neat surprise for the reader, because the reader will be in
Oh yeah,
suspense. You know, the character is dead. Who are we gonna substitute? Oh, we didn't substitute. Neat.
no,
Yeah.
no. We are getting, the passage across on Charon's boat.
Mm-hmm.
And it connects up to a lot of things, and I think it's the best bit of the book, actually, that chapter. And it was very interesting doing it and doing it. But one of my first readers for that book said that there was a piece of information that he felt needed to be in the book that wasn't in the book. And he said that I should write another chapter from one of the other characters' points of view at a certain point. And I said, but that would ruin the rotation. I definitely can't do that. I can get the information in, but
Mm-hmm.
not in that way. And it turned out that he had not noticed that this 93,000 word book was ABCD character point of view
Mm-hmm.
in very, very strict character rotation. But
Right.
he read the whole thing without noticing that.
Yeah, I think that when it's more than 3 components of the rotation, it's easy to lose track of. But yeah, different readers will or won't notice different things. Just indeed,
Yeah.
as different readers will or won't notice that it says chapter the second instead of chapter 2, or will or
Yeah.
won't really pay attention to, in the latter Terra Ignota books, or I mean, in all the Terra Ignota books, there will often be peripheral information at the beginning of a chapter. There will be the date on which the event took place, and sometimes the date on which the chapter is written, or the location at which it takes place. So it gives you a little bit of metadata. And some people really rigorously analyze that and note it down and think hard about it. And other people don't remember that it was there and sort of never noticed.
Yeah.
Which is fine, because you make the book work for both types of readers. But it's very interesting thinking through that kind of metadata, and that there will be variation in how much people remember it. And I'll give one example, and then I'd love to hear what you were about to jump in and say. But there's a really very smart and high-level animated Japanese series called Concrete Revolutio, confusingly with no N on the end. Concrete Revolutio with no N. And it has points at which the narrative is jumping around in time, and a screen will flash up very briefly with the date. And I kept being frustrated by this, because it would flash up just not long enough for me to register the full date. And I was about 5 episodes in when I realized, wait a minute, it's never different dates within the same year. All I actually have to be tracking on is the year. None of these flashes are within 1 year. They're all to different years. And all I have to keep track of is whether we're in year A, year B, or year C. I think it would have been wise for the creators to leave out month and day, because they were a distraction, and the only information that really yielded anything was year. And if you're moving in a filmed medium in which you have to move fast past things, you don't want to have extraneous information. Just the year would have been a lot clearer. When you're seeding information like that, the date and time, if it's prose and the reader is at leisure looking at it and can go back and refer to it easily because it's the beginning of the chapter, then I felt like including the day was valuable, because it only takes up a tiny spot on the page.
Yes.
And it lets people think through and double check dates. And when you have a later chapter which retroactively tells you what a different character was doing at a different point, you can realize that X character was doing this while Y character was doing that. But even in so subtle a change as the audiobook, in which it's much harder to flip back and forth between the pages that are the starts of 2 chapters to compare the date side by side, those details of dates become less valuable. And, for the audiobook, really only having the month would almost be better. Or having the exact day is much less likely to give any given reader/listener satisfaction from when it's in prose. And so it's similar in this animated Concrete Revolutio, where I think if that had been a comic book on the page or a novel where I was looking at those numbers on the page, I could have parsed through the month and day. But that because it was moving by at a pacing over which I don't have control, which is the main difference between audio and video media and text media, that the consumption is at a fixed pace and not at my pace. The information that you could meaningfully get across in the equivalent of a chapter header, i.e. an episode header or scene header, is different.
All I was going to say was, because some people don't pay any attention to the rotation and things like that, I had been expecting that readers would be thinking, oh, how are we going to have the point of view of the character who is dead? But only some readers would be thinking that, and the ones who weren't paying attention wouldn't be thinking it.
Yeah, makes sense. And that's you're always writing for a spectrum of readers, and you have to. You're writing for the readers who already read this book and are rereading it. You're writing for the readers who know the historical subject matter you're drawing on intimately, the people to whom this is totally new, the people who vividly remember all the chapter titles, the people who are good with names, the people who are bad with names.
Yep. You've got a whole lot of people there.
Yep. And you often have how can I remind people who this character is for the people who won't remember this name without annoying the people who do remember this name?
I sometimes think, people can just turn back and find if they can't remember it. But I think I'm sometimes wrong to do that, and I should give people more help remembering when there's a lot of names.
Yeah. It's tricky. It's extra tricky when your narrator has no reason to give us the reminder.
Yes.
And that can make it very tricky. How do we naturally slide in the reminder in this moment when it's hard to justify the character doing so?
It's one of those things where first person is so much easier, because when you're writing in first person, you can have the character give the reminder in character, and you can be establishing things. Not always, but often.
Sometimes first person makes it harder if the narrator has no reason to give you the reminder at that point. It depends on your first person. Because if it's a first person they're writing a history, or they're explaining this to some third party, or they're writing it down as a memoir, or it's a letter, then they might have a good reason to remind the addressee or the imagined reader what this is. I often can use that with my crop. But when it's, first person, we're watching through the person's eyes and as if a camera is rolling, it can be harder to be, the person is just thinking, oh, hi, it's Geff John. And
yes.
and
yes.
And doesn't have any reason to say, oh, yes, it is Geff John, my friend who I met at the thing and, did the other thing.
Yes, first-person brain dump isn't any easier than it is in third. First-person reflective is easier. First-person reflective is a form that I like, where the text is being written by somebody at a time for a reason.
Yeah, and it gives you so many tools. Although, and this is something that relates to chapters, it also means that every time you're crafting a chapter, you're thinking about how this character feels about writing this stuff down, and what this character knows about what's going to happen already, and whether anything has changed between this and the last one.
Yes.
So in the first two books of Terra Ignota, Mycroft is writing a history of events that are over at the point that Mycroft sits down to write it. So the whole thing has an emotional consistency. Whereas in the second two books, it's a chronicle and things are happening unexpectedly to Mycroft in between the writing of chapters. And so Mycroft might write a chapter and then sit down to write the next chapter in a state of sudden jubilation or sudden grief. And I have to think through carefully the mood with which Mycroft approaches each chapter. And that can make the craftsmanship of the beginnings of chapters especially both extra difficult and extra rich. Because if this chapter is going to contain an incredibly important world-changing thing, or an incredibly tragic thing that the narrator is just broken by, the narrator knows that, and it's just happened at the moment that the narrator sits down to write it. And so you have to make the opening of the chapter be authentic to the grief or dread or jubilation or exhaustion, the fresh emotion that the character feels, without giving away more of what you want to have happen in the chapter be given away than you would wish. Because they can start the chapter with, so-and-so is dead, and then you're in the Patroclus sequence of, but how did so-and-so die? Or they can start with, I'm overwhelmed, and you don't know about what. And then you're in suspense as to, okay, what has my narrator so overwhelmed that their chapter began with an incomprehensible tangent? Or you're almost reading the opening paragraph, hunting for clues as to what it is that has put the character in this very extreme mood, which is quite different from when they're writing it all at once and reach the chapter in which, a dear person, a tragedy is about to happen. And the narrator knows this, but it isn't fresher for them writing that chapter than writing the chapter before. It's distressing having to think about it and having to, this is the chapter where I have to face up to describing the tragedy at last. But there isn't shock. Whereas when it's live events or diary or letters, there can be shock as well. And that is both a craftsmanship asset and a craftsmanship challenge.
I found it difficult in among others where it was diary. I had to make it plausible that she would write out the events in order when something shocking had happened and you weren't going to find out until the end.
Right.
And that was definitely a craftsmanship challenge.
Because when you sit down to write a diary or a letter, you usually start with, oh my God, so-and-so gave me $1 million or whatever it was that the big thing is. And then you explain how it went. But you don't always want that to be the structure of your chapter.
Right. And I sometimes did that. But other times I had to work on it to make it plausible that she would sit down and write something that would take literally hours of writing before getting to the revelatory thing. And sometimes I'd lead with it, and sometimes I wouldn't. And it was a difficult thing. And also, I would then the next date would often be like 5 days afterwards,
because the person had to spend several days probably writing down the intervening thing too. That's true also in especially the first two books of Terra Ignota, that the how far apart the chapters are written. You can see this more in book 3 actually, where the dates are clearer. That the how far apart, I calculated carefully how long it would probably take the character to write the book. I then felt really resentful when I was like, this person wrote this chapter in 2 weeks. I wrote it over 7 months because but a person for whom these events were easy and who doesn't also have to write letters of recommendation would write this chapter in the course of 2 weeks. So that's a plausible amount of time.
I did a thing in The King's Name where I've got a frame on those books where the narrator is saying that she is 93 and she's writing the story of her long life, and she goes back to when she's 17 and it moves forward through time. And in towards the end of the second book, we are getting to the point where a beloved character is going to die, beloved by her, and I hope by the reader as well,
Mm-hmm.
but beloved by her. And so there is a chapter end at the end of a battle, and he's been wounded. And then the next chapter starts off with, I never actually told you about this training thing we did 20 years before this. I think I'm going to write about that for a while.
Ah, yes, the having the character be evasive about the next thing that has to happen.
Yeah.
It was just very powerful when the reader realizes, wait a minute, you're putting off telling me what just happened. Why are you putting off telling me what just happened? Like, Gene Wolfe does this in Book of the New Sun a couple of times, where Severian will be like, I'm fleeing the city now. Let me describe at great length the layout of the streets and the architecture and what the sky looks like. And you're like, Severian, why are you fleeing the city?
Yeah.
You're fleeing the city for a reason. There are people chasing you. Why are you? You're ashamed of the reason you're fleeing the city. I see. And then you gradually feel like you're coaxing out of him the actual shameful reason that he's fleeing the city. And it's a very effective method. But you have to note that your readers will realize at varying points that you're doing it, right? And some readers may never become conscious of the fact that the narrator is evading telling you the thing. And other people will notice it very early and have a meta intrigue of, oh, interesting, we've jumped around. Why did we jump around? Why are we suddenly in a flashback?
Yes.
Or a flash forward. Yeah. Very fun.
There's a painting in the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, which is by Barents Fabricius, who was a pupil of Rembrandt's. And it is St. Matthew writing the Gospel. And he's an old man, and an angel is whispering in his ear, and he is holding a pen in a very badly done hand, and he is writing. And he's got this expression in his face, and you can just tell that he's got to the sad part that he doesn't want to write.
Aww.
And that he would want to say to the angel, do I have to write Gethsemane? Couldn't we go back and write some more miracles, Do I have to write the part where Jesus dies? And, you look at that, or I look at that as a writer, and I recognise that's me when I get to the sad part of the book that I've got to write. And I don't even have the angel. I've still got to do it.
Well, but also we recognize that as something that our first-person narrators who are writing this as a document
very much
are experiencing. And you sit down and say, okay, I have to write this person describing this grief-filled incident. I want to communicate the character's grief. I can communicate the character's grief through making the narration suddenly a bit less competent and a bit more disjointed, and choosing less prudently how long to describe a thing, or lingering extra on how the air tastes, and describing stuff in that extra vivid way we do on a day when we've had shock and we have vivid visual recollection of the room we were in where the terrible thing happened, which is too vivid in our memory and therefore can be described a little too vividly by the narrator in a way that very effectively communicates shock and sets up for the reader to be prepared for the thing that's about to happen to be something that has shocked and grieved the narrator.
And again, this is a writing skills challenge to make that work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's often also, because it is often a chapter beginning thing in this situation, then it is a challenge that you're bringing the reader at that moment.
Well, and that can be thrown off very easily because you're writing it intentionally not your full craftsmanship, or you're applying your craftsmanship to making this thing seem a little clumsy in how it's crafted. And it's a very small push from it seeming clumsy in a way that's deeply moving and elegant and intentional, and seeming clumsy as if the writing is bad. And I remember, Joe, when you
Yeah.
first read a chapter in which I do this,
Yes.
and came to me and said, like, for the first time in any of my work that you'd ever read, that like that chapter just really didn't work. It needed to be
Yeah.
heavily redone. And I removed one paragraph and you reread it and said it was perfect.
Yeah.
And it was this very, very tiny tipping of and it was one of those flashback where they're evading getting to the topic by describing this other thing, but it was just a single paragraph too long of the thing, and it had to go.
And it was a new narrator as well, which did make a difference.
Mm-hmm. But it was a neat example of how that is a tricky technique that is immensely powerful when successful, but you really do, this is what good beta readers are for, need to get the pacing and degree of the slight shock, slight out of order, slight disproportion of description just right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's a hard thing to do. It is really
very hard.
Very difficult and very worth it when you can make it pay off. And another similar related thing that is often a chapter beginning thing in first person like that is suppressed excitement.
Mm.
Because you know that it's going to be there. You know, you the narrator know that it's going to be there and that you're bursting to tell it. Yeah. And that's another thing that is like
and that's
that.
exactly this. You can in the first sentence say, we landed on the moon, everyone! Exclamation point. And then which is the same as the so and so is dead. Opening sentence, or the Watson, it is with a heavy heart that I take up my pen to write the last words I shall ever write of my friend Sherlock Holmes, which tells you in the first sentence of the story what's going to happen. You can do that and it can be powerful, or you can say, no, I want the fact that they've landed on the moon or the fact that Holmes is dead to be saved for partway into the story and have suspense about it, but you think about the craftsmanship.
Yeah.
So a completely different facet of chapter planning that I wanted to make sure we talk about before we stop. When I'm starting a chapter, I find I tend to think of it as it'll either start with a line of dialogue or it'll start with narrator voice. And that those in my brain are the sort of two macro categories of chapter starts. That it'll start with a character saying something, and then we jump into what the setting is after we've heard the person say a thing. Or it'll be starting with the narrator making a comment. And sometimes the narrator comment will be quite short, or it'll start with a single sentence and then do other things. But to me, those are the two ways I tend to, I'll sit down and think about a chapter. How do I want to open this? I want to open this with narrative reflection, as opposed to, I want to open this with dialogue. Which has a very different energy, especially, I think, for us, Joe, for whom our narrative prose tends to be very metric.
Yes.
And my dialogue, at least, tends to be very natural and non-metric. And I think the same is true for you sometimes.
It varies. Again, this is a thing that varies with me from book to book, and I've written several things where the style is pastiche. Mm-hmm. So in the Small Change books, the third-person chapters of the Small Change books, the detectives chapters, are very much a pastiche of Josephine Tey and Agatha Christie and that kind of very particular kind of 1930s cozy mystery thing. And with the beginnings of those chapters, I was always thinking, do I want it to be hard or soft? Do I want to start with something that is going to be a jolt, or do I want to start with something that will be comforting? And so I was very much thinking about that, because the style of all of them was the same. But I was very much thinking about that when shaping those, because those are the two ways that you start chapters in those kinds of books.
Interesting.
But then with other books, yeah, I think about that kind of opening. Sometimes I will have the first sentence of a chapter and be excited about it and how I'm going from that. And sometimes I won't at all, and I'll noodle around and I'll know the sort of emotional feel that I want, but I won't know actually where to start it, and then I will see it and it'll pull me through.
Hmm.
Often because I'm trying to start either too early or too late.
Interesting. I would say I sometimes at the outlining stage, if the chapter is going to begin with a major, again, this is Terra Ignota specific and not quite true of others.
Right.
In Terra Ignota, when a chapter was going to start with a major Mycroft philosophical aside about something, that would sometimes be part of the outline. And this is the chapter that will start with the reflection on Terra the Moon Baby, and then these things will happen. That would sometimes be part of the outline, but other chapters wouldn't have any particular specific what's the beginning in the outline, and I would do it based on how the voice and mood ended up of the previous chapter, so that in my head it's dialogue versus narration as the beginning of a chapter. Though within narration, at least within Terra Ignota, there was a big difference between narration, which is Mycroft deciding that it's the correct time to lecture us about Diderot for a page, and narration where it's describing the car landed in a place and there was a mob and there was this and there was that, and these things happen, which are setting the scene, not giving a philosophical aside. But in some sense, when you turn the page and you see that the chapter begins with a block paragraph, there's a moment during which it doesn't yet matter whether the block paragraph is going to be the car landed and there was this and that, or whether it's going to be, by the way, Diderot. Because it's both telling you that your first experience is going to be with the narrator, not with other characters doing things. And there's, I think, a different energy to plunging straight into dialogue, which is often being in the hands, so to speak, of a different character or having a different character's voice going on, rather than the narrators, which is why, even though in some sense beginning with the car landed and we went here is more similar to beginning with, hey, look, they've landed, than it is with Diderot as a dude who did blah blah, which isn't setting the scene, and the other two set the scene. But on the other hand, which voice we're in, what mood we're in, how much of a change in mood it is different. And if the previous chapter ended with the narrator having a deep philosophical reflection, I'm going to be very conscious of, and if I start with the same narrator, it doesn't feel like there's been as deep a breath taken. It doesn't feel as if there's been as much of a change of mood. It feels as if there's more continuity. If I begin with somebody calling out, hey, look, it's Felix Faust, then we have a more complete change of mood. And that breath that's taken is deeper. Some readers will even, as they're deciding, should I pause now or should I not, will, in their peripheral vision, see in the next chapter begins with another heavy, long paragraph versus, the next chapter begins with a snappy-looking short line, which will affect the decision of, is this a moment where I feel like you need a break, or is this a moment where I feel like, some freshness and pep, which is what I want, appears to be available either in the form of going to the fridge and getting an apple, or in the form of reading this lovely piece of dialogue with an exclamation point on the end, which is peppy in the way that getting an apple from the fridge is peppy, in a way different from, reader, let me tell you about Terra the Moon Baby and reflections upon the nature of distance, for which you might want to go get an apple first. And so I think about what's actually the reason that the car landed and we went here is more similar in my mind to the Diderot intro than to the line of dialogue intro, is the effect that seeing that in the edge of your eye has on the reader's calculation as to whether to keep reading or pause.
So I think that I don't know whether to call this sort of plot or theme, but I have a thing that is going to happen in the chapter that I know is that the chapter is about.
Yeah.
And it might be plot, or it might be theme, or it might be something else.
Indeed,
But it
because
is the
sometimes the core function of this chapter is so and so has to meet so and fall in love at first sight. And sometimes the
right,
function of the chapter is we need to be introduced to the theme of space exploration being a focus in this book.
right.
And they are co-equally the function of the chapter, even
And
though the latter isn't a plot point. It is a thematic point.
And sometimes the function of the chapter is it's a Here's to Valhalla chapter, and that this chapter is there solely to give people an emotional break between two emotional highs. So
Mm-hmm.
we will have a chapter and it'll be doing a bunch of other stuff, but the real function of that chapter is to have a pause so that you can start going up again on a higher level of emotion. But I just realised, and this is true. The chapter that I'm writing at the moment is 2,800 words now, and it needs about another 500 words, and I know where it's going. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the chapter starts, the line snaked through the spaceport terminal. And this chapter is going to end when the character comes out of that line.
Hmm.
When he is at the conclusion of that line, and a plot thing will have happened, and he will have met two of the major characters and thought about a third major character who's been trailed through this chapter, but who we're not going to meet until the next chapter. But this is the chapter in which the line snakes through the spaceport terminal, and he snakes through the line until he comes out of that snake
Mm-hmm.
at the end of that thing. And that's the way that the chapter feels to me. And if I were writing a proper plot, this would be the snaking line chapter.
Right, in your
Even
summary.
though that's probably not how other people will think of it when they read it, if I ever finish this thing and anybody ever reads it. But that's how it is in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And you do feel those moments of, the reader needs a moment of lightness here. How do I do it? And it can be a whole chapter that's lighter. It can be a chapter that has a lighter moment or a lighter piece in it, or that, begins light but gets heavy again. But you can also find, even if it's, I need a whole lighter chapter here, who are two characters who are fun. Oh, neat. I can have these two characters who are fun having a conversation, which connects up and gives us some important information about the consequences of what's happened before, so that the character, what do we really need at this point? We really need to happen to hear what the political fallout is of the thing that just occurred. But we also need a moment of lightness. So I'll have the two characters who have a really good sense of humor be having the conversation about it. And also, these are both characters I want to give more development to. This works really well as a break. So it's not a vacuous chapter. It's a chapter that accomplishes a lot. But it's a chapter where you sat down from the beginning to say, all right, I need to accomplish the things that need to be accomplished in this chapter, in a way that also feels like, you're doing interval training on your athletic equipment machine, and this is one of the ones where it gets lighter for a few minutes, and you get to breathe a little more slowly and catch up on your oxygen before it kicks in the high intensity version again.
Yes, and your peppy apple as well. It's the same.
Yeah.
You wanted to talk about non-fiction chapters?
Sure, let's do that a little bit before wrapping up. So in nonfiction, I have 2 nonfiction books under my belt, and you have a couple which have a very different structure because yours are collected from blog posts. And I have one which is an academic book based on a dissertation, which in turn takes the structure of each chapter is a distinct body of research that could be its own article, which works as a structure, but is not a very thought together as a structure-y structure. Yeah, but the one I'm working on now, which has distinct chapters, I have felt myself using, dividing it into big sections. So there are 4 big sections, and then each section having a bunch of subsections. And that has flowed very naturally as I was working from the nonfiction book in a way that no fiction quite did. Um,
Well,
but it,
my essay collections are collections, and each piece was written as a shape, but I don't really think of them as chapters.
yeah, very much collection. So I think that, in the nonfiction history that I'm writing, a lot of the structure of history is here is my argument. Now I'm going to prove it. And what the reader is in suspense about, in as much as there's suspense, is what evidence is this person going to muster to argue this? Right? This person is arguing that the Renaissance was not a great time to live, that it was a rough time to live. Interesting. What is the evidence that they're going to use for this claim? And are they going to address the claims that are the reason that I always had the impression the Renaissance was a golden age? And, in what order and with what argumentation are they going to make this? But, you one of the best ways to structure history is you make your claim up front, and then people are excited to see you back it up. Or sometimes antagonistically confident you'll fail to back it up. But that sure still is something that's going to give them momentum moving forward to read. But it means that you can very easily have chapters and subchapters where the subchapter is the historic claim you're going to make here. Or the new piece of evidence you're going to introduce. So you can have the desperate Renaissance as a section, and then you have a section about Rome, the eternal problem city. And that's going to be how Rome contributes to the Renaissance being desperate. And then you can have, a Petrarch subsection, and then people know that that's how Petrarch is going to contribute to it. So they all become like the outline of a lecture or the outline of a debate, where you're saying, here is my argument and here are my 5 pieces of evidence. And that lends itself quite naturally to the chapter, subchapter section, because it's all about being upfront about what you're going to argue and then arguing it. And I know that I had to sort of learn how to do that, because my impulse was to save the revelation until the end and make my argument when I was ready. But it's easier to understand and remember the information if you know where it's going, if you have the argument on which to hang your information, and you know what all of these threads are coming together toward. These are all evidence that the Renaissance was a hard time to live. I know I'm reading along looking for things that are evidence that the Renaissance was a hard time to live, as opposed to, okay, we've had a lot of discussions of wars and of plagues and of life expectancy and of people not getting along with other people and of Isabella d'Este not paying her dues. I'm not quite sure where this is leading. It's leading to this, but by this time I've forgotten what some of the evidence was. So
Right.
that you benefit from the fact that people remember things better when they relate to something concrete or are serving something specific. And so by having the argument up front, the Renaissance, don't live there, time travelers, right? And then your evidence as to why, they have something to hook that to. And then people genuinely remember more of the material, even if it's the same material in a different order.
So the other non-fiction thing that I've written is my memoir, my travel memoir about
Yes.
a trip that I took in 2019, where the chapters are the days, and they're not organized by chapter except by day. But each day I was doing different things. So the day that I went to Voltaire's house at Cirey, and the day that I went to Diderot's house are the perfect times to talk about Voltaire and Diderot within the book. And then, Petrarch and the same thing. But there is also this arc of travel and where I was and what I was doing. So even though it's non-fictional and kind of true, I was still totally shaping the material that went into it. And I was definitely thinking hard about where I started the chapter, where I started the day, whether I started with getting up and setting off, or whether I started partway through with reaching somewhere, or again, whether I started with a philosophical discussion, or whether I started with breakfast,
Mhm.
in terms of what I was doing with all of that kind of stuff. But it definitely wasn't the kind of non-fiction where I'm making an argument, or mostly it isn't.
Right.
Um, it's just a record of stuff.
Yeah.
Uh,
Because nonfiction has a huge amount of breadth to it.
yes, but it's called Visiting Friends, and the friends that I'm visiting in it are Voltaire, Diderot, Petrarch, and Pico della Mirandola. This is available as an ebook if you want to
It's
read
really,
it.
really fun. But it's also,
Yeah.
I mean, it's an essay in the Montaigne sense
Yes.
of an essay of a meander through ideas and delight,
Yes,
and
that's
reflection.
exactly what it is. And it's also like other people's travel memoirs, that people write travel books that are just like that.
Right. Well, and some fiction which will divide by day,
Yes,
but sometimes it doesn't work. So the way, the first two Terra Ignota books are 5 days. And so it'll sometimes say, and this was
seven
the
days, isn't
end,
it?
7 days, it's 7 days. It'll say, this is the end of the first day, this is the end of the second day. This is
And
the
then
end
it
of the third
says,
day.
increasingly long days
Yes.
with the whole
Yeah.
planet,
And
and
then, and at this point, without actually sleeping, the day is rolling on to the dawn of the next day, even though we just kept up all night doing things, as the intensity ramps up. But that has to be not even section breaks. It's not section breaks, it's just comments as it goes, because the subdivisions there need to be by theme and place and occasionally narrator and time, and not by day. But day works well for other structures. Chapters
yeah.
are such great tools. They can accomplish so many things. That
And
breathtaking and reset.
I recently I've been reading a KJ Parker book. I've been reading a couple of KJ Parker books that are in a series, and the first one has very, very short chapters. The chapters are 1 minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and I'll read tons of them. And then the other book, the sequel, has chapters that are like 25 minutes.
Hmm.
And even though I am absolutely positive that when I was reading book one, I was reading it for 25 minutes at a time or more, it felt faster to read because I was coming to these little short chapters. And there were more breaks. And I
Mm-hmm.
could think, do I want to carry on reading? Or shall I go to the bathroom and then carry on
Yep.
reading? Shall I
Yep.
stop reading and read something else? And that it's just an interesting, different thing when it's the same author and the same series.
Mm-hmm.
To have that difference just because of
Yeah.
the chapter length.
Well, I'm, amid the trickle of lovely people on Twitter saying that they finished Perhaps the Stars, that it's great, I get occasional tweets from people on Twitter saying, I'm reading Perhaps the Stars and this chapter is really long and I have a job and kids to take to work in the morning. Why didn't you warn me this chapter was so long? It's 3 a.m. now. And I'm
Yes,
like, oh, I know which chapter you're in. I'm sorry. You can't
yes,
stop now.
yes, yes. Well, your bladder will make you stop at a certain point. Yeah, yeah,
uh, but
yeah.
but sometimes just the momentum needs that kind of length as well.
And it is unfashionable to have chapter titles. But I did it with Tooth and Claw, and I did it again with Or What You Will, and you've done it with Terra Ignota.
I wasn't aware
And,
that it is unfashionable. How could you possibly sacrifice such a powerful resource?
well, I'm hoping that people will start using them more again because they'll see how excellently you used them in Terra Ignota, because that was part of what I was thinking with or what you will, because I
Mm.
just loved what you did with the chapter titles, and I thought I could do such fun things with chapter titles and quoting things
Hmm.
in or what you will.
Yeah.
Every chapter title is quoting something, but sometimes you never know what. It would be hard to be sure what. Because one is quoting a play that I saw in Montreal in 2007 that probably nobody else has seen who would be reading the book or recognize, but I
Yep.
don't care. It's a good thing to quote in that context. And it's not meaningless if you don't know what it's quoting. It's a
That's
thing.
one of the keys. You got to make sure that thing will still work, even if
Yes,
people don't recognize that it's an intertextual reference to some other
yeah,
work. Yeah.
yes. People shouldn't feel like they're missing something if they don't get it, and then you're giving a delightful little bounce to people who do get it, and it doesn't matter at all
Yeah.
to anybody else. That's very much what I feel about that kind of thing generally. But anyway, it was delightful doing chapter titles, and I will do chapter titles in other things. I'm sure I will, because
Me
it's
too.
fun, and I'm wondering if this may start a trend of doing chapter titles because they're great.
I think they are. And I know with Terra Ignota, I made a special note to Tor when they were doing the layout asking, can you do that thing where the chapter title appears in the header on every page throughout the chapter? Because you're not consciously reading it on every single page, but you occasionally glance at it and you're reminded of it, and it makes it more likely that the reader will remember the chapter title when they get to the moment in the chapter that connects to that title, if there is a particular moment, or just that they'll be reminded of it as a thematic element as they move forward. And Tor's wonderful, delightful layout people who have always not only done everything I asked for, but even made it more beautiful than I ever imagined. We're happy to do that, and I think that it makes a big difference having it just present, so that you see it as you flip through and advance through the chapters. And I've been happy to see some of the translated editions maintaining that, because the chapter titles really are, the book works without, but that perhaps the stars hits double strength when you remember it from before, and a lot of things hit extra strong when you remember it from before. And some of the
Mm-hmm.
chapter titles, like Rose Tinted Daydream, that call back to other moments in the text, are very enhancing of the power of the thing. Not essential, right? It's the sauce on the pasta. The pasta is delicious even with just olive oil and pepper, because pasta is a wonderful thing. But the truffle addition to the pasta and the olive oil makes it even more potent. So this has been a great conversation. In my tradition, first we will gush about a book we've been excited by lately, and then finally the administrative mandatory podcast stuff. Joe, what's a book you've been gushing about lately, or would like to
So
gush about?
I've just finished Dickon Bew's Slow Train to Switzerland. One tour, two trips, 150 years, and a world of change apart, which is about a English guy who lives in Switzerland recreating the tour that was the first tourist tour that Thomas Cook did to Switzerland in 1863. And he has the diary and letters of the people who took that original tour. And he
Mm.
takes his mother with him, and they try to do the same things that they did every day, but now as much as they can. And if their hotels still existed, they stayed in them. And what it actually is a history of affordable tourism in Europe, uh,
Neat.
neatly intertwined with the history of Switzerland through the second half of the 19th and the 20th century and up to today, and how tourism has interacted with the Swiss economy and the Swiss culture and all of this. And it's really very, very interesting about all of those different things, as well as being a delightful travel story of people going to various places in Switzerland and having fun, which is just a nice escapist thing to be reading. But it's also got all of this other fun, interesting stuff going on. It's quite a short read, and I enjoyed it a lot.
Excellent.
So, how about you?
Well, I've been excited about a book that I know, Joe, you started reading also, which is Last First Idol, which is a recently translated Japanese novel, which was the first ever debut novel to win a very prestigious, Hugo-like award in Japan, making it the Seiun Award, making it a sort of a, oh, neat, what is happening with an uncommon instance where a debut work has won this. And it's a really odd work that's drawing heavily on tropes in the Japanese science fiction that we associate with anime, but also on idol culture, Japanese celebrity, the being an idol, which is a youth celebrity thing that's not quite the same as anything we have in US or UK celebrity culture, but comparable. And so it has aliens and it has artificial life forms and it has extremely violent over the top combat structured within this competitive celebrity idol thing. It's a very manic kind of pace. It's a very striking and strange book. Just interesting to glimpse an example of something where it's riffing on tropes you need to be familiar with for it to make sense. It's not the kind of science fiction that's approachable from just a regular launching off from science fiction stance. I guess I might compare it to Scalzi's Red Shirts as a Hugo winner, in that it's a Hugo winner with a lot of intertextual required past knowledge to understand what it's doing. So it's been neat having access to that. We often don't get translations of the Seiun Award winners out of Japan, and we often, in fact, don't usually get translations of most other countries' award-winning science fiction. I don't know, as someone who also read Joe, whether you want to add anything to it.
I didn't read it. I read the first third of it, and it was much too bloody and horror-like for me. After the world had been destroyed,
yeah,
and it was just so unpleasant, and I didn't like the characters.
It's very clearly being influenced by a recent trend in deconstructionist examination of both idol and magical girl culture, which was launched by the success of a series called Puella Magica Madoka. The word magi should be in there too. Puella Magi Magica Madoka is the series, which did a magical girl deconstructionist thing where it being violent was one of the things that was shocking and interesting, because in that style of narrative, usually there's extreme combat at which the world is theoretically at stake, but nobody ever dies. And so seeing a variant on that where the stakes were grim succeeded in being very surprising through pacing and very successfully deconstruction and triggered dozens of variant deconstructions of this fascinating genre, which is always has female protagonists and is about sort of empowerment and combat, but can also be very male-gazy and disempowering depending on who is writing it and how it's being structured or what exactly is going on. And there's been a burst of that in many different media. So some of it comic books, some of it prose. In which I think the violence is there as one of the ways of signaling this is going to be a deconstructionist examination of this genre instead of a straightforward one. But you're right that it makes it horror-like and off-putting in a way that
and there
complex.
Was a giant plague that killed most people and everybody left has cancer. And I just found that a bit grim.
Yes.
And I just wasn't enjoying it, and maybe because it is so much in dialogue with things that I'm unaware of from other
I think it's
directions.
I think that's part of where that's what gives you the interestingness to get to move forward through it. But I also think that it is grim and that it's being grim partly because it's going to do stuff with the grim, but partly because being grim is a signature of this style or
Right.
this way of deconstruction.
But
And
that's not something that I
yeah,
enjoy, and there were bits of it that were sort of positively stomach churning.
well, and it makes me
And
think about how rare but also delightful some of the works that are deconstructionist but not violent, like Sugar Sugar Rune or indeed Astro City, are when they are being mature and intelligent and questioning the tropes of a medium at a more adult level than normal. Pluto would be an example of this as well, but not doing so by suddenly being grim.
yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a wuss. I do not like reading horror. I do not like reading things that are
It's fine.
distressing,
Yeah.
and it was distressing. And I asked you if it was about to get good and about to change, and you said no, it was going to carry on being like that. And I stopped reading it because I just wasn't having any fun, and I read
Mm-hmm.
for pleasure. And there was not pleasure happening. But I totally agree with you. I want to see more things in translation, even if they're things I don't like.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm not at all sorry that I paid for this book, and will encourage them to
Yeah.
publish more
More stuff in
translations.
translation. Yes.
And I'd like to see more things in translation from other places as well,
Yeah.
from other
I think we're
languages.
getting we've been getting a lot of Japanese stuff in translation because of anime manga fandom. We're now suddenly starting to get Chinese stuff more,
Yes,
which is really good. But and a little bit of Finnish stuff and French stuff. But let's have more translation. We should be like France that gets translations of everything.
right.
Anyway, and
Would
we
be
should.
it would be great. I would really like that. And I am more inclined to read something if it is in translation, and I might be getting that,
Yeah.
whatever it is. So even though I didn't like this particular book,
Still exciting that it's out. Last first idol.
okay, let's do the boring bit.
Yes.
This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives International 4.0 license.
You can support us and get episodes in advance at patreon.com/Ada Palmer, and you can support Blue Joe and get her wonderful poetry, as well as this morning's translations of two sonnets about the French invasion of Italy in 1494 at patreon.com/Blue Joe.
And you can find us on Twitter and our books and things at joewaltonbooks.com and adapalmer.com. So until next time, ex urbe ad astra.
Ad Astra.